Okay, welcome to the OASIS Talk series. My name is Olli Satama, and I'm so like honored and excited to present today's speaker, who's Professor Florence Chee from Loyola University, Chicago. And then the next section I will need to read. I didn't memorize this. So Florence Chee is an associate professor of digital communication and the director of the Center for Digital Ethics and Policy. She's also the founding director of the Social and Interactive Media Lab, which is based in Chicago as well. Yeah. In today's talk, Florence has promised to provide insights into how we should approach the intersections of ethics, law, and policy when studying games. And before we get started, I just want to pay attention to the fact that this is not the first time she's providing a talk in OASIS. I actually remember pretty well the talk from 2019, but what I learned today, this morning, is that actually the first talk actually took place already in 2014. So welcome back, Florence.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Yes, I remember being greeted by Jaakko back in 2014 when I was doing a visiting stay in Uvasco at the time, and during Johannes, I managed to get myself down to Tampere, and it was such an amazing experience to be here visiting this amazing space. And Olli mentioned the Sim Lab, and I was thinking, I wish SimLab could be this kind of amazing space, and it has always served as kind of a mental model for students and beyond doctoral level faculty interaction, and where games really comes together in a very public way. And so I've always admired the model that OASIS represents, and so I'm happy to come here for my third time. And I was just in Vasa, and we'll fly to Manchester tomorrow. So it's my pleasure today to talk about how games are, for me, growing up. And I'll talk a little bit about these growing pains. Having started out as a game culture researcher in a very big way, and going now towards a little bit of the work in ethics, policy, and law that I'll share with you today. And of course, if you are around this afternoon, I'm happy to continue chatting in various get-togethers about some of the nuance of this research. But this lunch hour is perfect for a little overview of some of these issues, and the main message being is that we can't kind of stay in our very pure silos any longer, even if we're not interested in the broader systems and policy structures. I was talking with Olli about it seeming like a really boring thing, but actually AI regulation has been coming into the fore, and games are, of course, being swept up into that arena as well. And that it is long overdue that more of us become involved in very real lawmaking and decision-making structures in our local communities and worldwide. So a little about me that Olli generously talked about, so I won't spend too much time, but this is the one-sheet rundown. Basically, how did we get here? I'm going to lay the foundation of how I started out as a game culture researcher. Some of you may recognize this very relatively local image. This was from 2014's visit to the makers of Angry Birds, Rovio. And this was a time when I was curious about building upon some earlier research on Nokia, and how Nokia basically had all these people working in the mobile games industry, and the evolution of games from that time of having a very talented workforce, that, you know, having this sticky market, and yet continuing on into the workforce that produced Angry Birds. And so this very much aligns with game production studies and trying to understand the industry, and not just the culture that playing specific games entails. So, you know, sometimes when I talk about the games industry, when I talk about games in general, those of you who don't know me, those who are less kind and don't know me, generally ask like me to prove myself. So I'm just gonna get this out of the way and just say, oh, like, you know, in response to like, do you even game, bro? How I started out, you may be familiar with like Jesper Juhl's baby Commodore 64. I started playing this in the early 80s, just to give you an idea and massively date myself. But all right, arcades. Yearly, my parents would make a trip to Nevada in the US. I'm originally Canadian from Vancouver. We would go to the casinos. So gambling is, so a spoiler alert for this one. But I would spend a lot of time in arcades, and all the games, got really into pinball. Nintendo, Game Boy, of course. PC games, Tetris, Carmen Sandiego. I try to be Carmen Sandiego nowadays, and so you know, I'm going everywhere trying to do this field research. Online text-based BBSs, PlayStation, first-person shooters, going into internet cafes to research how people play Counter-Strike has been a research project. RTSs, of course, to look at game culture in Korea, especially. But I started playing in Canada back when StarCraft first came out. And so that was a comparative standpoint type of research project. MMORPGs, EverQuest. I presented in 2003 at the first DIGRA conference in Utrecht, and that was based on MMORPG research to do with EverQuest at the time. And, you know, here's the pivot point, really, that I see. Social network games, Farmville, Candy Crush. This started to change how much I enjoyed games for me, and it started to kind of not make me such a gamer, really, in the digital sense. I started to move more towards board games. Like I like Settlers of Catan. I like Carcassonne. League of Legends has been a thing. Mobile games in general. Nintendo Switch. My kid, I have an 8-year-old. We play lots of Mario Kart, board games, and Minecraft, Roblox. This is what carries us into today's age. And so the past 20 years were kind of a context for how my book that I was published in 2023 on was digital game culture in Korea, where I looked at the argument basically at the time the games were an addictive substance. That as soon as we unleashed a game into the world, that it would become really irresistible. And particularly, I looked at Korea because they were held up as this flagship for online game addiction, problematic behaviors, everything we know about esports, I argue, comes from that context. So much as we worldwide have esports teams, I argue that the genesis is really from Korea. And it played a foundational role in game culture. I did situated work where I go all over Asia to find where people were playing games in public. And I would talk to people and they say, like, we modeled this internet cafe after those in Korea. And so, this is a relatively under-acknowledged thing, surprisingly, but I try to remind people, I guess, as a professor, you tend to get into this role where you remind people where things kind of came from. And yeah, at the risk of aging myself in a very young, youth-oriented field, um, this is our charge now. And we have to coincide with the evolving platforms and the legal ramifications that come of that. This was already in place. Some of you are familiar with the documentary State of Play from 2013. And it talks about pro gamers, so esports athletes, at the time, and what their motivations were. Again, I'll kind of hint at the spoilers where the team dynamics kind of take a downturn. There were numerous of what we know by now are price fixing scandals in esports, but we can see price fixing and kind of quasi legal behaviors surrounding gaming increasingly so. And it's this gray zone that we're seeing now evolving through different countries, different currencies, differing practices, a lack of understanding of technology by local governments, and an attempt to regulate it according to whatever local structures exist. So back to the Finnish context, where I'm talking to people and getting reacquainted while I'm here. And again, it helps to remember that in this constant drive to succeed and talk about all our successes, that we need to remember that this situation wasn't by accident, that there were failures. In fact, 51 failures is famous before Angry Birds came about. Right? So Angry Birds was like just this wonderful hit that a country like Finland enabled to happen through a number of circumstances. This is why, coming from Canada, where I saw policymakers being flown to Korea to find out what was successful about the game industry there. Let's try to replicate that secret sauce. And that's what I found very curious, is because I cut my teeth in science and technology policy, coming from communication. So we look at innovation, or what enables cultures of innovation, what are particular regional circumstances that enable innovation. And with the case of Angry Birds, this was a example of having a safe way to fail. And that this is really important for games to continue to thrive, is if you're only talking about the successes, you can't really have a sustainable model. So you have to include possible failures, and even so, they might not be failures in their own right. They just might be not at the right time. So that's kind of a form of basic research, right? It's not necessarily even a one-to-one relationship, like you get a law degree and then you can become a lawyer. You get an architecture certification and then you can become an architect. This is an example here at this lab where you're talking about all these different critical issues, and maybe you're applying it today, but maybe it'll come in handy years down the line. But this is the perspective that I argue for in a broader, more liberal arts kind of approach to critical studies of games, is that it does include places you don't think you'll end up. This was post-Gamergate in 2015, where it was suddenly invited to the Chicago Bar Association, where this is now with lawyers, right? And the beginnings of lawyers who were kind of coming up through the system, interested in games, and not just interested in regulating the games themselves, like in terms of end user license agreements and whatnot, but they were interested in all the disparate effects, like Gamergate, like online harassment, like currencies, right? Virtual currencies, whole other area that I didn't imagine myself getting into with fintech, right? Like financial aspects. Learning about cryptocurrencies and securities and the differences between. So, a bunch of growing pains there. Lifelong learning, it's great. So, given that Gamergate was really a focus on the ethics of, right? So then I kind of turned to ethics in a multiple number of ways, whether it was how our data is collected and managed. Again, the nostalgia path that I took you down earlier with where I came from with games used to just be able to pick up games and start playing. Now you have to put in an email address. You have to write your address somehow, even free to play games. You know that they also collect your data and that you are rarely in a situation as a game player now where your data is not being collected in some way. This has, of course, privacy implications. There's also the ethical implications of whether or not people should be collecting data, particularly from vulnerable communities, because consent is an ethical issue. If you have a child in your home, for example, and data is being collected about them from day one, is that ethical? They are unable to consent technically. And so where this is a bit strange for thinking about law is the law says, well, that's technically legal because there was a terms of service, right? When the parent bought the game, they signed off, right? And so this is how law can stay unchanged unless we are actually able to show other problems that arise from a practice. So here, these are kind of an ad hoc list of things that I'm thinking about right now that I've been working on for the last 5 years or so in a concerted way. Cryptocurrencies, I mentioned, artificial intelligence, rights respecting practices, multi-stakeholder dialogues. I didn't imagine being involved with the United Nations at all, but I've been brought on to the 3C roundtable on artificial intelligence, particularly as a gamer. And in these situations where there's lawyers, they need my expertise in games, in the metaverse, in virtual currencies, and ethics. That's something they haven't been trained in. So I feel like, you know, we as game scholars coming up, this is a really ripe opportunity to kind of meet these various stakeholders where they are. Okay, so ethics, rather than this kind of binary existence, which we've been talking about, is not just what we can do technologically, because yes, we can send someone to the moon, but we talk about whether or not we should, right? And then when it becomes a judgment about whether or not we should, this gray zone is basically the uncomfortable space where a lot of us can contribute some insights. So in terms of games becoming datafied, You can boil everything down to ones and zeros. Even the biometric data that is collected about ourselves at work, at rest, and at play. Voice data is biometric data. Your eyeballs are data. If your institution collects data about you in the United States, that can look different depending on the state that you're living in. I happen to be from Illinois, and Illinois has really good biometric protections for its residents. If you go anywhere to a neighboring state around there, they don't have nearly the types of biometric protections. And that's just looking at one country. A lot of different things going on in the US, as you probably have no choice to be aware of right now. But this is a part of what I've been exploring from an ethical point of view, which is predatory inclusion. So we talk about preying upon vulnerable communities as a kind of other, like we would never do that ourselves. But in our own practices, if our business models are relying on the acquisition of data, of opportunistic data, whether a child is just saying, Alexa, can you play me this song? And they are being monetized from day one. Are we okay with that? About that? Are we even aware of what can happen to their data as it's collected, bought, and sold into different contexts? And so, a lot of the issues that we have with artificial intelligence nowadays predate artificial intelligence. This is part of a special issue that I was guest editing, the Journal of International Review of Information Ethics. Check the date. This is like 2022, before ChatGPT made everyone aware of generative AI, right? So that was going to be later on that year. But here's this article that still is super relevant and important, because here we go. Mentions, okay. Presents and discuss technological approaches that allow for the development of games that verifiably protect the privacy and freedoms of players. So this was already a conversation before we threw the window, even like before we threw the door even more open to all the implications that people are now finding AI, machine learning, how machines learn about us, how they learn about vulnerable communities in general, even how we construct beauty, right? So what is beautiful? Type it into Google search, for example, and Google is just going to spit back out at you what it's learned from its garbage searches right? About what beauty is. And if we're only giving authority to these machines to spit out what they define as these kind of normative concepts that are actually based upon like really complicated cultural structures, then we're going to be in trouble. And I know a lot of people are realizing that, but in games we need to realize this more, because concepts like privacy, user rights, they are daunting, they are serious, and these conversations are taking place very easily. As you know, game researchers tend to ignore, unless they are in serious games, they tend to ignore the serious applications like military applications, autonomous weapons, drones. Right? These are all regarded as kind of separate. But where they kind of converge in these areas is now like, look, I started out as a media researcher, culture, StarCraft, but yeah, war and Marines and all these things are part of war games. And stuff that I used to find as just fun, now they do intersect So with the Freedom Online Coalition, I was talking with human rights lawyers with the Task Force on AI and Human Rights. And they were talking about things like social scoring, whether or not that's right or ethical to have, and what kind of laws and regulations do the EU folks favor? What's happening in the US? What's happening in China? Games are global. We play games from China, right? It's not like we can really isolate ourselves from various places where these games come about, nor should we. But we need to be all kind of sharing in this literacy, right? And it is time for us, talking about myself, you know, not necessarily saying you, but like I've had to feel like it's time to grow up, right? Privacy is a human right. The United Nations said so a long time ago. And we've really, with technological advances, kind of forgotten that as well. Look how it would apply now, right? No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. All the time, we are in violation of this, but like how literally are we supposed to take this when the very things that we rely upon to make the world go round? I experience conveniences too, enabled by these large mega corporations. But at the same time, it's a relationship of immense ambivalence. How do we reconcile the violation of privacy? Do we always consent? And GDPR is responsible for all the times we get annoyed by cookie dialog boxes. But I've been doing a research project where, okay, we can phrase these dialog boxes differently. And so does this compel users to actually give consent, or do they not, right? Do we just say, okay, just allow and go away? And that's what most people do. But that means that we're not providing meaningful, informed consent. And so does the law then take our so-called consent and run with it, saying, hey, they already consented. I mean, this is nothing new. But that's how AI systems are largely obtaining all this data that machines are able to learn from, right? So we've heard about perhaps training data. And training data is built upon power, systems of power, systems of oppression that are largely decontextualized from their original point of collection. And so that is something that, you know, if you're talking to data scientists, they're just thrilled to get a complete kind of data set. Like completeness is a very strong concept to try for. So if you're doing like an empirical experiment in a lab setting where you can control things, that's great. But if you start making interpretations for social phenomena, you can imagine how that might become more problematic. If you're looking at a city and all the different functions and dysfunctions a city entails, culture, deviance, right? Having deviance is a part of living together. We're smoothing it all out. What are we actually making decisions based on that the AI has supposedly learned about us? So this is ongoing too. It's not a one and done kind of issue. So it's just March 2025 here. These these new practices as the technology changes. Amazon will listen to all your voice recordings if you use Alexa Plus. I used to tell students who I teach ethics to, okay, don't worry about that. It's not really listening to you. It's just gathering data from all like the websites and locations that you're at. Now it's actually listening to you. So it's just like Black Mirror. Just afraid this would happen. We still need to sign on to things like this, where we're arguing. There is a scientific consensus that everyone can get behind, that bias and discrimination in these data sets exists. It's not objective as soon as you data wash it, right? And this is actually a contentious position to take sometimes, but as scientists, we need to stand together. Just to give you an idea of predatory inclusion, I did a little Google search on that as a concept, and this is the AI overview I got, and it was a very, shall we say, sanitized version of their overview. So if you're a student relying on Google search and you get this AI overview, you just cut and paste, you're replicating this kind of incomplete, non-nuanced kind of language. It doesn't serve anyone. And so, you know, this is to argue for all of us kind of being at the table, and all of us like could imagine ourselves, we're not even close to being done talking about these issues. And I'm just one person, but you know, these are attorneys, professors in law schools, a judge, and me. I'm not an attorney. Like, it's just, look, I tend to be the only non-lawyer on lawyer panels these days because of expertise in games. So it's not a frivolous endeavor. It's not removed from like economics, law, and policy. It has to include these perspectives that are specialized. Look what they're doing at Roblox, right? Roblox, my kid loves it, you know? Going back to what I mentioned earlier about gambling, I've had to come full circle to looking more at gambling these days and the social implications to that. Shout out to PhDs who are coming up looking at gambling and games, because that is a super promising area, which we are working in concert for understanding. In terms of the future, DraftKings, familiar with DraftKings? Okay. So sports betting, sports, gamification, all that stuff is still coming to the fore, where we have like crypto, futures contracts. In Canada, this is where DraftKings is legal. But all these provinces, this is my home province, they've already had lottery corporations, esports betting a long time ago, just not DraftKings. Here in Illinois, fully legal. The state itself has aspirations to becoming the Las Vegas of the Midwest, just FYI. And yeah, that's not to say that there aren't some kind of other mechanisms where you can bet on sports, because as you know, NCAA, college, collegiate level sports, really big deal with betting nationwide. And that's in addition to scholarly endeavors at the university level. So, yeah, generative AI is moving faster than anyone could have expected. And so sports betting and AI are indeed intersecting in various ways, where entire sports are being invented. You can you can watch any sports and bet on them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And how does this bode for our lives as humans? Um, why don't you use crypto? Just try a little bit of crypto. This is what my apps are telling me to do. If you can just make your like $5 and just buy some crypto and like get started, but it's not insured or protected at all. It's just you should try it, normalize it, and you can kind of guess by my tone what my impression is. So these are some calls to regulate sports gambling promotions from colleagues in business school. But all in all, I'm just encouraging us to take this moment, if you weren't already interested in AI, in crypto, in gambling, in data, regulation, because it sounds boring. It's actually not really boring. It's right at the forefront. And again, an old favorite. I really love this slide. Thank you for your appreciation. I'm advocating as an educator always to include this kind of ethical, technological literacy initiatives from the K to 12 before they come to us in the university, because by the time they come to us in the university, it's too late, right? Like they need to know. And I am encouraged by some of the initiatives, but they're by far not universally applied. This is just the WHO page on vulnerable populations as they define vulnerability. The conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or systems to the impacts of hazards. Play can be hazardous. This is a smart cities panel that was on this spring. Again, talking about data and the smart city and how our neighborhoods can be gamified. Issues like this, you've probably seen before. This is not a new issue. I know there are many Pokemon Go lovers over here, but these are issues because Pokemon Go relies upon maps that were constructed with histories, right? Whatever the histories are in terms of racial segregation are not visible on Google Maps necessarily, but they do come into play when you encounter human players in the everyday world. Next week is Dutch Digra, and I'll be giving a talk on smart cities and game engines. This is, for example, Utrecht and how their attempts at using digital twins play into the propaganda of trying to promote game engines as ways to render cities. Ethical Games is an initiative where I've had the pleasure to participate in. It's relatively new. You may know that the first games conference for this initiative took place January 2024. So a relatively new area of ethics and games, specifically for a conference, has taken effect. And so this bodes well for being a growth area. And I've already been in contact with game developers who are looking for ethical solutions and ways to incentivize business models in a kind of safer, closed environment. It's confidential. This is all volunteer work, by the way. It's service. And, you know, the profit motives are secondary in this effort to do good. But we can also not equate ethics with a lack of innovation. You can be very innovative. You have to be more innovative sometimes to find ethical models that aren't just the boring old profit at all costs. Lastly, I'd like to give a plug to this edited volume coming out, edited by Patrick Prax, Clayton Whittle, and Trevin York, looking at sustainable game design. And so we have a little chapter here with my colleagues, Torsten Busch and Tanya Sivonen. Together we stand, divide we fall. How can game developers navigate the economic, social, and environmental sustainability challenges of the game industry? So we're talking in various ways to game developers directly through academic praxis, but hopefully we'll be able to launch this at GDC coming up. So that's it for this massive overview, but I hope that you've gotten an idea for some of the historical aspects and growing pains, and possibly a better future with all of us in it. So thank you.
Okay, we have nicely time for questions and comments. Who wants to start? Jakob was. Then I mean, like, it was a microsecond.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm wondering, since sort of you're mostly talking about digital games here, do you feel that there are places where we could draw from on good practices in some other neighboring areas? Are there areas where we could learn from, or what do you think are the areas that we should be studying to be able to make digital games more ethical?
Well, in many ways, like I said about AI, the issues that we're finding with AI predate the emergence of AI, right? So similarly to games, games are a reflection of the culture that they emerge from. And I approach this from like an anthropological point of view, humans first, and how they branch off into forms of play. Again, this is nothing new to game studies in general. It's really not just digital. So to bring communication theory into play, we talk about the laws of media. And absolutely, when we look at games as a form of communication, you know, what came before, what came after, why is this coming about, how do platforms come into play, what exactly is the cultural context that makes this particular game interesting, for example. To use StarCraft, StarCraft came out in 1998. Hello? Hello?
Should we use this one?
Yeah.
Oh. Did it run out of juice, or?
It might have.
Okay, sure. All right. So StarCraft came out in 1998. So I played it in North America. And I went to Korea for the first time in 2004. There was still a thriving culture surrounding StarCraft. Right? So whether people were spectating, using the game in esports, or having something completely unrelated to the digital game itself, this was just a catalyst in that environment for why StarCraft culture was such a big deal. So I would lead with culture. And that's kind of the lens that I work with in media culture. But you know, what we regard as a medium is you know, can be the unit of examination that changes from place to place.
Thank you so much for your talk. And
I've been experiencing something similar in my own research. I usually look at Japan, and now I'm looking into gamification. So that like there's a similar road there. And one of the things that I've been doing is looking at the European initiatives on like more gambling-like behavior and practices within games and regulation. And one thing that I've noticed, and I also saw it in your presentation, is this focus on, usually when there are initiatives, it's very much focused on like vulnerable groups like children, right? Yet also something that I noticed in your talk, you're talking about more like in general, right? There are general issues, and then there is this focus on vulnerable groups. Is there something that you've noticed while you were in all these panels with lawyers and politicians as to why there is, like, I do understand why there is that focus, right, on children, but do they also take into consideration just general audiences, players, users? Is there something you can say about that? Yeah.
I'll get my exercise here.
Thank you. So my convenient go-to is children, but as you may know, it is difficult to get proper consent from children for research personally. Companies, though, they get data from children through various other kind of marketing technologies, which, you know, are interesting because games companies purchase that data from those marketing agencies in order to not have to collect data directly from children. So again, the law kind of acts as a protective barrier in that respect, for better or for worse, depending on who you are. Some of these panels we're talking about elderly. The elderly being encouraged to use crypto for their retirement savings. And at one point, you know, the regulatory environment was not friendly to crypto, and so they kind of backed off that idea. And now the regulatory situation has become completely flipped around, where crypto companies are basically full steam ahead, and these vulnerable communities who are the elderly and upwardly mobile, because in the US especially, crypto ATMs are being installed in communities of color to directly target those communities as means for upward mobility because of the promises that come with crypto. Now, you know, you can tell I'm a bit skeptical about that, but I've shown these movements to community organizations, and they're absolutely shocked. So this is something that you can do in your own communities, is, you know, have the people there be aware of some of these changes that may happen above their heads, where they don't really have a say in the future. And this happens with gambling a lot. I have a lot to talk about with that. But yeah, that's an example of adults who may be vulnerable in different ways, being beholden to some of these changes.
Thank you.
We have a question from our online audience. Rafael Marquez asks, thank you. When it comes to legislation and regulation of games, one key challenge is the influence of industry lobbying on one side, while on the other side, it is difficult to mobilize or raise awareness amongst the general population. What are your thoughts on this gap?
Could you say that again?
Yes.
Exactly.
The gap between, on the one side, industry lobbying, and on the other side, trying to mobilize the general population or raise awareness on the general population of the issues that.
Yes. Right. So what I find interesting is something that I can point to directly that's happening already. In contrast to the US, which tends to espouse a self-regulation kind of strategy, they have lawyers in game companies that, make sure that the company is acting within the law. So nothing they do is like technically illegal. And when it is, that's the way they self-regulate, is through law, like litigation, right? But in the EU, what I've seen is various individual countries protecting consumers. So the makers of Fortnite, right, like Epic, they were in the news not that long ago with regard to being fined a couple €100 million for practices that unduly pressure children to make transactions. And this was the Dutch Consumer Protection Authority. Only the Netherlands, right? Belgium has also made moves to make loot boxes illegal, right? But it is like country to country where they might have a certain local sense of what's going on, right? EU, with like the AI Act, right? That tries to get a consistent way of handling AI-specific issues. And that is law. It's not what the lawyers criticize as like ethical, wishy-washy kind of principles, but an attempt to really hold companies accountable. This is kind of the only way it can happen in this context, where if you're a small company, then you're always having to point to a bigger company who's just doing it, right? You can say, oh, well, they're doing it anyway, and I'm powerless as a small player. So this is the tension, is we need like bigger regulation in some cases to make it so that the big companies have to comply, so that the small companies can also comply in concert, right? And it does matter, right? It is a business issue, given that games are often developed by small kind of indie game developers and small little like SMEs. Like they're not these huge anchor firms and AAA, quadruple A studios, right? That's a different behemoth, but you have to make those big companies comply before the little companies are able to comply as well.
Okay, got at least two hands here, and we got around 5 minutes, so snappy questions, please.
Oh no, I will try my best. This is not very clearly formulated, so apologies for that. And thank you so much for the very topical, super interesting talk at first. But I would like to hear your thoughts more on the research ethical perspective on studying these kinds of topics. Because at least in Finland, maybe other European countries as well, the guidelines kind of state that to conduct ethical research, we also need to follow the law, which means not only following the GDPR, other data protection acts to the dot, but also following things like terms of service of these technical platforms, which really don't want us looking into the kind of things that they are doing, as you have just described in this talk. So I would like to hear more about your thoughts on how to conduct this kind of research ethically from your perspective and based on your experience and expertise in this area.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've been publishing in this area since 2011. Right. And this was on the heels of how we felt as researchers, qualitative researchers, being treated differently from quantitative researchers who would conveniently scrape data from the servers and say that, oh, we get informed consent anyway. And so the research ethics boards would say, yeah, sure, you've got informed consent, because you clicked I agree, or the users clicked I agree, and all that data is able to be provided to third-party researchers. Qualitative researchers like myself, I have to go in person and, encounter humans in their lived context. It's a different perceived level of risk to some of these evaluation review bodies. So they're more, well, they have been more, they've been applying more scrutiny to some qualitative research projects. And so we spend a journal article like just talking about all of that. And that's, I can share that article, Remediating Research Ethics, by myself, Nick Taylor, Suzanne de Castel. And then later on, we also talked about Gamergate data and the ethics of care. We had to apply to that model back when Gamergaters were really posting a lot of nasty stuff to Twitter, 4chan, 8chan, and our decisions regarding the handling of that kind of toxic data. We, in the end, decided to apply an ethics of care to, and I can also share that journal article and book chapter that comes out of that research as well. But yeah, there's a lot there that keeps going back to the agreements you sign already as gamers and game researchers, that we are implicated in a web of legal agreements, whether we like it or not, and we need to be literate in those methods of communicating what we can do and what we can't do.
We got a couple of minutes left, so I mean, like a quick question and a quick answer. There we go.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. So it's very interesting when you're talking about ethics and legal frameworks and enforcers, right? And the cultural history of what manufactured these things. I'm also thinking a lot about how these different forces have very different values at times. You mentioned the UN rights to privacy, right? And certainly Donald Trump does not believe people have a right to protection in reputation, right? His value system has nothing to do with that, clearly. And so have you ever how do you deal with this when you're talking to people about ethics and norms of people with very fundamentally different value systems at play, where they are not seeking the same goal in their ethical rule setting?
Yeah, exactly. It's like super nice.
I can do it.
Okay.
But yeah, thank goodness I'm around for the rest of the day as well. But yeah, this is the issue where we have to lead with our values, and right now we're kind of lagging behind, like as the voices of ethics. I'll tell you though, at these various points of transition that I mentioned in my talk, when games became datafied, suddenly our consent was really, really in observable danger. During Gamergate 2014, right? So this preceded, or it kind of heralded the rise of the alt-right in a very mainstream way. And so this is the power of games as well, is to, like, I'm not the first one to say this, to kind of show the world what the social issues in media are going to be 2 years later. And so it's kind of a pattern where we're talking about this in games, and because we can get a handle on what's happening in games, we're discussing it maybe 2 years before suddenly everyone's talking about AI, right? And this year, it's like such a deafening conversation in AI. But again, I'm going to these various venues and talking about some pretty old stuff, but we never resolved those issues before, right? So the same kind of culture issues, the same kind of oppression issues, ethical issues, which are very, very old, right? These are all still relevant. and we need to be talking about how they apply to things. And we're not looking at anything new, really. And that sounds boring, but at this particular cusp of technological development, this is as cutting edge as it gets, where you're helping to form policy guidelines and eventually the laws that truly are binding and that entire nation states have to deal with. So, you know, it is pretty exciting, all said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As Florence mentioned, she'll be around later today. We're gonna have lunch, so feel free to join us if you want to have a chat. And we'll have our next OASIS talk later this week on Thursday, I think. So be prepared for that one as well. Thank you, everyone.